At 7 o'clock. Welcome to Training Tuesday. We're getting started because there is a lot of information to share tonight. And welcome to our first Training Tuesday of 2024. Happy New Year, everyone. It is a joy to welcome our panelists, Dave Scholler and John Gutierrez, and for his 11th episode, first episode of 2024, Paul Eichelberger, the team who does our data analysis and statistics gathering. So we are glad they're here to share their expertise and to give us little insight for what to expect with Statistical Reports 2024. But before we begin, let's take a moment for a word of prayer. Holy and gracious God, as we gather this evening from a variety of places, we are reminded that we are watching or listening in the comfort of our own homes. And as the winds howl and the rain pours down, we are mindful of those who are sheltering outside. So we pray, oh God, that we would be an answer to their prayers to provide sustainable housing for those who have to brave these elements. We pray for your Spirit to be upon us tonight, O God, to give us insight, wisdom, and understanding as we receive this information and as it expands our understandings of how we are to measure and count those gifts and people to whom you've entrusted us. So bless us, O God, in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
So as we get started, I do like to remind everybody that we are recording tonight's episode, and PowerPoints will be available following tonight's presentation. And you'll want to pay careful attention because we have some unique PowerPoints for each of our annual conferences. So we welcome our siblings from the Peninsula Delaware Conference and the Baltimore-Washington Conference tonight, and we'll be covering that which applies to both annual conferences, and we'll share some information that may be for each particular conference. But without further ado, let me hand it over to Paul Eichelberger to get us started tonight on Statistical Reports training.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I want to welcome everybody to tonight's training on statistical data and the collection of that data over the next couple weeks. I wanted to use this opportunity also to do a little bit of an update, to go back to, I now serve as the conference treasurer in both conferences. We've had a busy 6 months, starting in July when I transitioned into the responsibilities of working with Bill Westbrook on his retirement. Bill retired at the end of August, and we've been successful in being able to get me into the middle of the details associated with Peninsula Delaware. That's been a good start for the last 6 months. I've been working well with the Board of Pensions and the trustees and the CFA. These are all groups that we're just about to go through our quarterly meetings here this week and next week. We've had some major projects in the Dover office as the financial system came to a point where we had to do a major revamp of the financial system. We're in the midst of launching that. If many of us on the call know that we're billing pensions and benefits that are coming out of the new system now to some degree. January 1st was our launch date for the new financial system. And so the team that I have here today is a major part of that work with me over the last 6 months as we prepare to do the launch of the new financial system at Dover. Dave has been with me for 13 years in Baltimore-Washington. John has just recently joined this group, but he's been with Baltimore-Washington in various capacities, most recently as a district administrator before he came into our data group. I just can't thank them enough for the amount of work that they have done. Bill Westbrook is still in the picture with us as we're doing this system upgrade. And I would say the four of us plus the team in Dover with Chris Berry and Terry Cleary and now Aim Banks, that group has really done some significant work over the last 6 months to get us ready to launch a January 1st new financial system. So it's in the context of that work that we now switch gears a little bit and add on top of that the collection of stats. So it's nice to have projects, and those projects that work in those types of details with financial systems allows folks like Dave and John to really touch a lot of people within a new organization. So that 6 months doesn't seem like 6 months. It seems very compressed for us as we've learned to work with the AAs in Peninsula Delaware. We know the financial team. We know Christine Trott. We know a lot of folks who have really helped us bridge the gap and allow us to come up successfully in the financial system. And it is that same connections that we've established over the last 6 months that has allowed us to now, I believe, take on a challenge of teaching statistical data collection to 2 conferences who do have, this is the affiliation connection that says whatever makes sense, bring together as the affiliation. And we are going with the assumption that our stats collection has enough similarities with it, that this is a good training for us to have as a combined affiliated conferences. But I also have to warn us that not everything is perfect. Not everything is exactly the same in each conference. So there are shades of gray between the 2 conferences. There are nuances. We certainly ask you to listen to our presentation tonight, and where we really do have some precise things about the differences between 2 conferences, I would just ask that we allow ourselves to hear that first, and then let's go through and see if there are any questions that come back that really, if we get you too confused on this, let us know, and Bill Brown will help decipher us and get us into the right areas where everybody needs to be. The first time that Dave and I worked on stats together to do this training was 13 years ago. Dave did this at the Fulton office for the Baltimore-Washington conference. It was the first year that he worked at the conference, and I had my bags packed, and I was joining the cabinet on a trip to Zimbabwe. So I never got to see the end results of that training, but I do remember Dave sweating in the midst of it all, trying to think all of these new nuances associated with stats training that he had to bring to everybody that day. It was just a good challenge. Do you remember it the same way, Dave?
I do. And it was, we changed quite a few things about stats. So there was a very large crowd, and I was learning along with everyone else as I was learning the ropes too. So it was a good learning experience.
Well, Dave, I thank you and John for the work that you've done to get us ready for tonight. We have some very good websites, resources. I've been very pleased with the work that you've done to get those materials on our website, and I look forward to the training that you're bringing to us tonight. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
All right. Thanks, John. Well, welcome everyone from both Baltimore-Washington and Peninsula Delaware conferences on this rainy evening. We are pleased to be able to bring you information about statistical reports. And unlike the first year that I did this, I'm pleased to report that we haven't made many changes this year. So it should be familiar to those of you who have done this for a few years. Obviously, if you're new to the game, we look forward to having you increase your knowledge. We really do thank you for spending the time with us tonight. It really is a great stewardship to your church to know the ins and outs of the statistical reports, because it can make such a difference to your local church. So we thank you for taking the time with us. So quick recap, or not recap, but preview of what we're doing tonight. Paul already gave us some introduction. We're going to walk through statistical reports, what we collect, how we collect it, why we collect it. We're going to talk about some timelines, touch on accuracy. We'll break away from the PowerPoint about 1/3 of the way through, and John will give us a walkthrough of getting into the stats system, getting your account set up, and walk you through all the details of that. And it will also walk you through Table 1, which is membership details. I will cover Table 2 and Table 3, and also because those tables are where apportionments or mission share are drawn from, I will try to walk you through some important things you need to know there as well. And then we'll wrap up just talking about some tools and resources that we have as well. As Paul mentioned, we have some new tools available. We have a dedicated page now on the Pendel's website, so we want to steer you in that direction as well. Okay, so we've made some introductions of the presenters. We also want to recognize the district administrators from both conferences, Andrea, Crystal, and Sarah in the Pendel conference, and our 8 district administrators in the Baltimore-Washington conference. We rely on them throughout the year, and certainly during the statistical report collections, because we know they are the first line and often the first person that you are talking with when you have a question. We do encourage, although Paul, John, and I are always available, we encourage you to reach out to your district administrators if you have questions. There are 11 of them and 3 of us, so they have us outnumbered, but it also helps them to serve you. And if they are stumped by your question or need some additional information, we stand ready as well to be resources and either back them up, or we'll give you a call directly and answer any questions that you have. So statistical reports, what gets collected and how? So it's a 3-part process with statistical report this way for quite a while. Table 1 outlines and is the area where you will report anything involving church membership and the participation of your church members. Table 2 is where the information about church assets and expenses are reported. Table 2, as I mentioned, is very important because that table and the information in that table is where conferences, for the most part, gather the information that they use in various types of calculations that result in the calculation of the mission share or apportionment amount for the church. So that's a important table. And again, we're going to touch on some of the issues that could impact accuracy and make sure you steer clear of anything that's going to cause you to over-report numbers that might have an impact there. And then table 3 is all about church income. It's probably the most streamlined and easy of the tables at the end. All of these tables and the questions therein are mandated by the GCFA, General Council on Finance of Administration of the United Methodist Church, and they have a set of questions. As you can imagine, with data collection, if everyone is collecting things in a different way, it's very hard to aggregate data and make sense of it. So they have a core set of questions that they want all conferences to use, but they do allow individual annual conferences to ask additional questions, or sometimes annual conferences will ask for more specifics within a question. We'll touch on some of that a little bit later. The statistical data collection, we know that both Pendel and Baltimore-Washington have various sites within their websites where folks go for various registration and some other issues. But all of the statistical data for both Baltimore-Washington and Pendel is reported at the central site hosted by GCFA, and that is stats.gcfa.org. No www in front of it. So everyone is going to be directed to put in their statistics at that site. So key dates. Tomorrow, we are going to have the systems opened up at AC Stats so that you can go in and get your account set up and start reporting if you are ready to do so. January 31st at midnight is going to be the deadline for reporting statistics. That said, we realize that sometimes the unexpected does happen. Church may run into an issue. If you do run into something that you think is going to prevent you from hitting that deadline, please know that we if you want to reach out to your districts and just let them know what's going on, and a week grace period will be extended to you without any issue. So again, just keep them in the loop, and we can certainly understand when things happen. All right, so why are statistics important? The old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. Oh, and also, like most things in the Methodist denomination, the discipline says we have to. So there's 2 paragraphs in the discipline. I won't read them, but basically it says you have to complete statistics, and everybody has to do it in a uniform manner. It has to be done annually with their forms, and again, for the reasons I specified, so that everything is consistent. The data in stats, everyone asks, well, what are you collecting all this stuff for? What good is it? It really is important in a wide variety of settings. First, we're looking at church vitality metrics, both locally in the jurisdiction and the United Methodist Church as a whole. So that information is important. We also want to look at any information that could be critical in evaluating how the church could progress towards various missional programs. We want to draw comparisons between congregations and districts, and so we can see if what churches are doing right, so we can try to learn more from their experiences and make that a benefit for others. As I mentioned, computing the mission share or the apportionment for the church. And then on the metric side of things, again, the metrics for the church, the vitality metrics and other things are important to the cabinet when they're making decisions regarding appointments. So it is very important, as I mentioned, that not only the stats are reported, but also the accuracy of the statistics. You can imagine with only a couple hundred churches, an error made by just a few churches can really throw things off. Again, the information is important. So we ask that just some common sense measures for stats reporting, and a lot of those are kind of a year-round process. Just good planning and record keeping, double checking your work, having someone else review your work. I really cannot stress that enough. I would say the vast majority of times when we get a call from someone months after stats are finished to say, oh my goodness, we can't believe we made this error. Most of the time it's because one person looked at it and only one person looked at it. And especially after being in a document, just like anything else, you get blind to the work that you're doing, and just have somebody else look it over. It really does pay dividends and prevents a lot of errors. Not recommended, fudging and wild guesses. I think it was early on in my tenure here, and I excitedly came into Paul's office and said, I can't believe this metric has gone up by such a huge amount. And we realized that somebody at a church was having a bad night and put a bunch of zeros after a number because they just felt like putting a different number in there, and it really threw the numbers off for the whole conference. So no wild guesses, please. And then in the area of accuracy and helping you with accuracy, the AC stat system is very nice in that it will flag big variations in numbers. Various lines have different thresholds. And if a number that you're putting in the current year has gone up or down dramatically, it will highlight it and ask you to put a very brief explanation. Really, more than anything, it's just making sure that you realize how much it did change. We realize most of the time there is a valid explanation for that, but that little flag and that explanation line that was added years ago really did make a huge difference in the accuracy and preventing mistakes. So it's a really good feature that has been baked in. Financial and data reports. If we can't make sense of things, we may ask you for additional information. So again, stats, located stats.gcfa.org. And as mentioned, we have 2 dedicated pages on each conference's website with some shortcuts, so you don't have to type in a big long address. bwcumc.org/stats and pendel.org/statistical-reporting will get you right to the page that you want for stats. And it has a variety of downloadable resources, stats, worksheets, information and instructions, everything that you need that will help you get through this process is on that. And then in addition to those resources, the recording of tonight's broadcast will be available probably after January 12th, after we get that all configured and edited. So at this point, Johnny, go to the next slide.
Yep.
So we're going to cut over to John. John is going to walk you through account registration and setup using AC Stats.
First thing I want to point out, so you're going to be using your GCNO, which is the general church number for your church, and that can be found at www.umdata.org. Just as a heads up, the data in there is from 2021, and they're in the process of rolling out a major update to that system. So if you see something that's old, don't be alarmed, but the GCNO should be accurate for you. All right. Right now, we're going to pop into the stats system. So as David mentioned, we are at stats.gcfa.org. No need to add the www to that that address. So here, last year we had a number of folks that had accounts already set up in the system. GCFA has actually wiped out all those church user accounts. So no matter what level, no matter if you had an account last year or not, you're going to have to make a new account for this year. So if this is your first time logging in, the login will be the GCNO, as we were saying, at umdata.org, if you need to find that. And the password for this year is stats 2023 with an exclamation mark. So capital S, TATS 2023 exclamation. One of the nice things about you guys might be familiar with this, but if you're ever needing to see the password you're typing in for somewhere, they offer the little eye icon there, so you can make sure that your password is correct. And then feel free to hit login. You'll notice a note up here saying that users with an existing account, so this is after you've already created your account, you'll use your email address and password that you set on your own to log in. For now, we're going to the first login. And if you're the first person to log in for your church, you will not see anyone else under the registered users. If you do see folks under there, that just means that someone else registered before you, which is not a problem as long as you know the person that is there, or at least you know that another person is supposed to be there. Yes.
Could you, just because I'm old, don't have my reading glasses on, could you click the magnification up on that one notch?
Sure. Sorry.
Fellow middle-agers in the audience. Thanks. That's good.
Sorry for that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. From here, if you do see the people listed, that's not a problem as long as they're people that are with your church. You'd click I'm not listed, and you're going to fill in as much information as possible. You at least have to fill in anything with a red star that'll be required. So call this person John Doe. Email address will be jdoe@email.com. Current role is important. The system allows multiple users to be in for a single church. But we're recommending, just so that for the sake of not having too many hands in the pie, to make sure you limit as many people, limit the people that are actually involved with putting stats in. This will reduce the chance for errors or corrections that are not corrections and such. So call me a church treasurer. My phone number is 123456789. From there, I'm going to set a password. And again, we have our eye icon. We can check that out. And you're going to click register with local church. If it has worked and it is all set. You should get this successful registration. If you do not, or for some reason the GCNO does not work out, check with if you are not the first user to be logging in that you know of. Check with your pastor, or pastors check with your treasurers if you're new to the church, for instance. And as always, worst case scenario, go ahead and check with your district administrator or administrative assistant for the district, or last case, check with us and we can try and help you out. So from here, you have an opportunity to verify the church details. So we're not able to change details in this screen itself. However, if you see anything that is incorrect here, please make note of it and send an email to your district administrator or your administrative assistant. They're going to contact us or will go into the Chronicle system, make the change from there, and from there it'll populate into AC Stats. It may take a little time for that change to actually be visible within AC Stats. There's a vetting process that they go through within GCFA to make sure that a change is legitimate. But rest assured that if you see something and you notify us about the correction, we'll make sure that it gets to GCFA. From here, we're going to click on Annual Report. That'll take us into the statistical reporting system. So you'll see here at the top, you'll be able to see that it's your church and which conference you're with. So you can verify that you are indeed in the correct church. If you click on instructions, you'll note there's a few things here that are actually really helpful. One of the nice things about this system is that it's constantly saving your inputs. So when you put something into a field and then click out or tab out of it, it will save that information. So you don't have to do anything to force that to save. Now, it's important that everything that is in here is filled out. There will be errors and such if, as we were saying before, there will be errors noted if there is a zero where there should be something, and you'll have to make an explanation. So as much as you can, make sure you have accurate and complete data as you're going in to fill this out. And if you have any questions, there's actually a help feature I'm going to show you in a moment that'll allow you to show help for each of the questions. And as always, you can always ask questions along the way with us if you run into something where you don't know how to answer that question. You can come back and change values after you have submitted, but values cannot be changed without us. Sorry, excuse me. Backtrack that. If you have not yet submitted, but you have gone here and entered values, you can change them. But once you've submitted, we take that at the conference level as that your stats are completed. If something needs to be changed before the deadline, or even later on, if there's a correction that needs to be made, let's say you guys thought you had the right information and got an update and it needs to be corrected after the deadline, contact us and we can unsubmit and modify those answers. This is to make sure that, again, as much accuracy and verification is done on all these numbers before they actually get to GCFA. Moving down, we're going to start with Table 1. Table 1 is reporting demographics. Actually, forgive me, I'm forgetting one major thing. There's two new things for 2023. The first thing we're going to see in Table 1 is a question about members received from closed United Methodist churches. And that's going to be in line 2G. So it's just another mode to identify new members to your church. And the other one is going to be a breakout of housing expenses. This will be new to the Baltimore-Washington conference, maybe familiar to those in the PDC. But Dave is going to talk about that later when we get to Table 2. But moving into Table 1, you want to note that right here, you see the column for 2022. These are last year's stats. As you go, every line will have last year's stats next to it, so you can use it as a reference. And in addition to that, you'll notice there's a print function up here. So if you want to print this out and work on this offline away from the actual website, you can feel free to print this out. And if you haven't put anything into the stats as of yet, it'll basically give you blank cells that you can handwrite anything you want into for that. So let's say you have several stakeholders that need to fill in data, and they work better with paper and pencil. You can use this system to print that out and give them a physical copy, or to create a PDF and send it to them that way as well. So if you have any questions about that functionality, feel free to reach out. Before I was mentioning that there is help for each question. You'll notice this toggle right here allows you to actually display the help information for each question. So several questions might not be intuitive just by looking at the description. So there's a broader description of what's supposed to be in that field that you can toggle on and off as you need. So going into the data entry for table 1, the first part of it's going to be the actual membership numbers for your church. Line 1 is going to show you the total professing members reported at the end of last year, and that will be pre-filled. If you go to the bottom, you'll see the professing members at the end of the close of last year. Forgive me. This number will be affected by all the numbers that you put in between line 1 all the way through line 8, and those are totaled in line 9. So starting at the beginning of the year, we have five folks for the church. As we add folks, the numbers into these cells, they will total out at the bottom here. And you'll notice we were talking about the flag for major changes within the numbers. This is where you can actually see that within the actual line itself. So you'll notice there's only 5 people reported here. So that's quite a significant difference between last year and this year. So it's asking us to provide an explanation for that. So explanations can be just simply, we had more people die this year. We had more people baptized this year if it's an increase, etc. As detailed as you think is necessary for us to understand what happened. Moving into ethnicity. Ethnicity, the numbers within here should total the same total as line 9. So you'll notice this is basically breaking out line 9 into multiple different groups. Again, if the totals here don't equal that, it'll throw an error and let you know that that is not correct. And again, gender, you'll see that it's another breakout of the same line 9. These should equal line 9 up here. And moving into attendance and baptism. So the average worship attendance is something that we track as an important metric for each church. This is folks taking attendance at each church service and such. So any questions about that, you should be able to we can answer for you. We have information about in the instructions on both the conferences websites. We have a description of how to calculate numbers of persons who have worshipped online. I believe we have that in our help here as well, to provide a better example of the best way to identify those who have worshipped in person and versus online. Then baptisms, pretty self-explanatory. And then from there, we move into how your membership participates with your church. We have the various groups that the church members are part of. So that starts basically with the youngest and moves on into the oldest. And then looking at the total of those lines 15, 16, 17, 18 in line 19. And then again, we have classes and other small groups that that are available to you to identify. And then averaging the weekly attendance for things like Sunday school, the number of folks that have participated in Vacation Bible School. There's ongoing classes, and then groups other than Sunday school. Again, you may not have all of the things to put in all of these, so the default would be 0. But if you have any questions about what would be identified as one of these groups, just feel free to reach out. And then we have United Methodist Men and United Women in Faith memberships. And in here, we also have the amounts paid for those projects. Now, again, we're reaching into areas where there might be some differences between the Peninsula Delaware and the Baltimore-Washington Conference. There are essentially the same kinds of questions being asked. So if there's a difference between what you're familiar with in what I'm showing you right now, it's probably due to the difference between PDC and Baltimore-Washington Conference. And then finally, we're moving into how people are engaged within and outside of the church. So we have mission, which focuses here on UMVIM for the BWC, and then ministry engagement. Again, self-explanatory, asking number of persons who have been served by the community, a number of persons who are engaged in mission and community, and the various focuses that would be encompassed by ministry engagement. And that concludes table 1. At this point, I'm going to pass it back over to Dave.
Great. Thank you, John. At this point, we know we've been talking for quite a while, so we wanted to break away from the presentation for just a bit. Bill has been collecting your input and questions in the chat area, so he's going to take it from here.
So John, as always, we want to get those questions captured while it's still fresh, your material. Several duplicate questions. When a person goes in for the first time and creates the account, the password that they create, is it a universal password, or will each person subsequently create their own password?
Each user will create their own password. The very first time you log in, it'll be the standard password for the for both conferences, which is Stats 2023 with the exclamation mark. Okay. But then when you actually put your information in and register yourself after that initial login, you will set your own password there. And from then forward, you'll be using your email address and password.
And so now when you want to allow somebody else to create an account and their own password, how do you do that for the next person, like your treasurer or for the membership secretary?
The same process, actually. They would go in using the GCNO and the standard password. And then when they reach that screen, they should, that's where you'd see potentially another couple people having been registered. And if you do not see yourself in that list, you say, I'm not listed, and then follow the processes I identified. Okay.
Now, will you be able to continue to work in the system if the profile data needs to be updated, or does everything? Yes. Okay, so you can still work in it. Excellent. And just to remind people, is it correct that before as you are working on your stats, before you hit submit, the platform is automatically saving your work as you go through?
That is correct.
Okay. Simple, detailed questions. Is line 1, is that pre-populated, or does somebody enter the data?
It's pre-populated. Okay. It's based on last year's total, finished total, ending total, I should say.
And Somebody has a privacy question. Then how do they determine the category for each member where they should be reported without violating that person's privacy?
I'm not certain I understand the question. The reporting individuated numbers within the so for instance, a person's a gender or elsewise, or is that
I'm
not what you're saying?
gonna take some liberty with the question, or at least provide an answer. You can correct me. I don't think anyone's privacy is violated because no individual names are associated with statistical reports.
Absolutely.
So they would not know that if you list someone's ethnicity as African American, who that particular person is, or if you list them as a male member, they would not know who that individual is, so that there is no privacy issues. Is that correct?
That is accurate. All these numbers are anonymized.
Somebody has again a question about online worship, that they run a Zoom service at the same time as their regular service. The people on Zoom are unmuted. They share in the prayers, reading of scripture, lifting joys and concerns. There's interaction between the people in the room and in the Zoom. If they do have accurate attendance for everyone who's on Zoom, do they still count as online, or do they count them as in person, as the same as if they were in person in the building?
And Dave, please correct me, because you're probably more knowledgeable at this. But my understanding is that if they are online, they are participating in the service online, then they would be counted as being online.
Okay.
Yeah. This question came up while the information for that area was added during COVID, and this was a often asked question. There is some additional information on there, but if it really comes down to whether the church is meeting in person or not, whether or not they're included as an online or in-person worshiper. So if the church, for whatever reason, is closed, no one's worshiping in person, the online count would be of the membership would be added to the average worship. But if they are, standard in-person worship, it's going to be a supplemental number. And just to note too, there was sometimes confusion. Those lines, they're not additive. It's both or. So sometimes when the people are confused and they put those numbers in and they don't see them adding up to take the total average weekly worship. They're separate, complete buckets. So.
Staying on the worship question, Dave and John, somebody's asking, because Christmas Eve was a Sunday, do you count the Christmas Eve services as part of the weekly Sunday attendance, or just the Christmas Eve morning that would correspond with your morning worship attendance?
And that one might stump. I think that one stumped the panelists. I'm about 90% certain there is something that touches on that in the instructions, whether it's the standard Sunday or versus holiday. So I would encourage you to look at the instructions for that, but because I'm fairly sure that is a common issue.
Well, and I would add, when I was serving a local church and filling out statistical reports, even when Christmas Eve was a Sunday, we did not count the services that we labeled as Christmas Eve services as part of our Sunday morning worship attendance or statistical reports. We tracked them separately so that we could compare year over year. But it's for those years that it skewed it so much, the next year when Sunday was not a Christmas Eve, the numbers would be so off that it was not providing accurate year over year tracking.
Bill, I like your answer on that one.
For groups, are call-in prayer groups considered a group, weekly prayer groups?
To my understanding, yes. There would be a small group.
Okay.
Bill, I have more information courtesy of our information page on our website on the in-person worship. So the instruction is the average in-person worship attendance at all services held on a consistent weekly basis as the primary opportunity for worship. Count all persons, including children, who participate in part of any of these services. Do not include online worshipers nor attendance from irregularly held special services, i.e. Christmas Eve services. So if Christmas Eve is on a Sunday, it's included. If it's a Tuesday, Christmas, or some other day of the week, that should not be included.
Okay. Why don't you carry on? I'll go back through some of the questions and see what we've come up with, and then I'll come back. Carry on.
Great. All right, John, if you pull up the PowerPoint for me. Okay, so table 2 is where we are going to pick up. Again, table 2 is the category of that table is all assets, debt, and expenses related. Some of those expense lines are used in the calculation of your mission share or apportionment. One key takeaway is that, and this is neither conference, expenses associated with mission programs or community outreach programs are not used in the apportionment calculation. So that could be expenses associated with nursery school, outreach, soup kitchens, shelters, food pantries. If you have direct expenses that you incur because you are sponsoring somebody for like Boy Scouts sometimes, any of those mission and outreach expenses should not be reported as an operational expense. There's a line above table 2, at the top of table 2, it's direct and indirect missional expenses, and that's where those are reported. So make sure that you report it there so that you are not lumping that expense in as part of your mission share or apportionment calculations. In the same vein, capital expenditures should not be included in your standard operating expenses. This could be loan payments, mortgage payments, large purchases or repairs. If the roof, if you need a roof repair, something like that, that should be included below your operating expense. Same thing goes with short-term rental agreements that you may have that you incur expenses for. So make sure those are broken out. The instructions for the capital expenditures line does include some examples, but again, anything that's a one-time or infrequent repair or issue that you have to take care of, painting the whole church, repair to a roof, damage to a roof from a storm, something like that, we realize those can be significant expenses, and we want you to report them outside of your normal operating expenses. So pastors' compensation is the top of table 2. Sometimes there's questions about what to include and what not to include. We do recommend that you look at the paperwork and forms that you filled out at your church conference. A lot of times there has been lots of explanation given in regards to what is and is not included in the compensation for the pastor. But on a broad brush, it's the base salary. If there's other areas of compensation that the church may reimburse the pastor for, or any types of bonuses, those are included. Any kind of tax deferred compensation or contributions, and any sort of equitable compensation should also be included. The reason that is bolded is GCFA offered some guidelines and clarification to that 4 or 5 years ago. Some conferences and churches were, for example, if a pastor was making $50,000 a year and the conference was paying $10,000 of that $50,000 expense, some churches and conferences were saying, okay, well, let's report $40,000 instead of the 50, and then we'll report the income from the conference on table 3. GCFA realized that that was skewing the numbers. They really wanted to make sure that they were tracking the actual compensation the pastor was receiving, regardless of the source of that money. So they asked that all of the compensation is included regardless of the source. If there is equitable compensation used or grants included, those can be reported on Table 3. Definitely make sure that we see this as we see more multi-point charges. It is very easy if you have a pastor that serves at 2 churches and the churches are part of a multi-point charge and they're splitting that pastor's compensation 50-50. We will see that it's an area of error sometimes where church A will report the entire compensation for that pastor and church B will do it as well. So they've inflated the amount that they're reporting. If you will report what you are responsible for paying for that pastor. So make sure you are aware of that and report just the amounts that you are responsible for paying. Make sure you also do not include clergy related health and pension benefits costs in the compensation area. There's a separate line for that to report that area. So make sure that that's not lumped in. Again, touching again on the capital and fundraising, this is on the expenses. If you have a capital campaign as opposed to a capital expense, capital campaign, obviously just fundraising type activities, anything associated with that fundraising activity. If a church is kicking off a big building campaign and they have a party, they're renting tents, they might have catering, that type of thing. All of that, it should be listed as a fundraising expense on Table 3 and not lumped in with your standard operating expenses. So another example given there is might be a rental of equipment or even a space. You might rent an event space to host that event and any sort of expenses associated with it. Any standard fundraising expenses, we often get questions, well, what about our envelopes and mailing statements and that sort of thing? Those expenses do getting reported as an operating expense on Table 3, even if sometimes there's consultants or vendors you use to help you out with those activities. So make sure you do include those, but if it is a special campaign or a fundraiser, you can report that outside of your operating expenses. In and out costs are an area where churches will sometimes over-report expenses. As the title indicates, this is where you are collecting expenses for something and then you are paying them out. So if you have a youth trip for your youth and you say the tickets, we're going to XYZ place and the tickets are going to be $150 a piece, you collect all that money in and then you pay it out to the location or where you're going. That's not coming out of your pocket. So that's really not an expense for the church. They're just taking it from the left hand and they're handing it to someone else. So we call that an in and out cost. And those are fairly common in the church for any type of trips or activities. So keep an eye out for that. Also, as mentioned before, don't include expenses for mission and outreach. Expenses, both direct and indirect. For the Baltimore-Washington conference folks, we also have the ability, as Paul mentioned, every conference does things a little bit differently. So for the Baltimore-Washington folks, on our statistical reports page, we have a utility expense calculator for looking at the utility expenses associated with hosting some of those activities. So avail yourself of that on our statistical reports pages. So mission share calculations, again on Table 2. As a broad brush, we are looking at pastoral compensation. There are areas to report both the lead, the associate pastor or pastors, and deacon or deacons compensation. Also housing allowance or parsonage expenses. As John mentioned, this year, this is more familiar for the Peninsula Delaware folks. But it has been added to the AC stat system online for the Peninsula Delaware folks. And also this is kind of a new breakout for Baltimore-Washington Conference. Under the housing allowance, in the housing allowance area, it has always been the case, even before we had the breakout, that what is reported there is either going to be the pastor's housing allowance, the part of their compensation that's allotted for housing, or if you have a parsonage, that's where you would report the actual expenses associated with the parsonage. The new lines, they break that out. There's one line for housing allowance, and then there's another line for housing or parsonage expenses, and there's a third line for parsonage rental expenses. So you're either going to report in housing or you're going to report in one or both of the parsonage expense areas, not all three. So keep that in mind. I think it will be helpful for everyone. Sometimes we see, especially churches with parsonages, sometimes, and it's easy to do, those expenses for the maintenance and upkeep and utilities, what have you, will get lumped in with the operational expenses of the church. And the way both conferences calculate their mission share, that could inflate the mission share. So make sure that you are breaking that out where you see that on table 2. Also, again, don't include medical and pension costs into either the compensation or the housing allowance areas. There's also going to be lines for church staff and diaconal ministers, and local church expenses or program expenses and operating expenses. So program expenses may be materials and books for your Sunday school classes. Operating expenses are kind of the catch-all for everything that it takes to run the church day in, day out, from utilities, contracts with cleaning crews, you name it. We have it in bold because it's important and we see it a lot. Make sure you do not double count in those areas. And we see it quite often. So if somebody, you're reporting a salary, make sure you don't put that amount again into your operating expenses, either for just a regular church staff member or a pastor. The exception to that would be if you have somebody that you're paying, a contractor that you're paying with maybe a 1099, say it's somebody that is your church janitor, but you pay them with a 1099, that would be part of your operating expense. But in general, either staff or pastors, the salary should be reported on their individual lines and not lumped in, so that you double count. So table 3, that is the most straightforward of all of them. It will break down all the areas where a church receives income. It starts out with the number of pledging units in the church, collects information about the income received from pledges, and also non-pledging but identified giver, just cash in the plate type donations as well. And then there's also breakouts for any income from interest or dividends, sale of church assets, and then special areas such as fundraising is where that is reported. So the expense for a fundraising campaign would be reported again on table 2. The income from the fundraising campaign would be reported on its own line on table 3. Capital income from capital campaigns, memorials, endowments, and any other projects. United Women of Faith, have their own special breakout for that as well. And also you will see listed your general advances and special giving reported there. That is a very straightforward table, and but if you have any questions about it, please let us know.
And that actually ends our main presentation portion.
Yeah, so any other questions? We are glad to answer them.
Dave and John, we lost Bill. So we think we lost the internet at Bill's house.
No.
So we tried to triangulate enough so that somebody would be able to host this webinar if one of us were to lose power or lose the internet.
No.
Let me go through some questions that have come in then as we completed. Musicians, are they included in the operating expenses?
If they are paid as a 1099 vendor, they would be part of the operating expenses. I would, sometimes churches will record that as depending on the setting, either a program or operating expense, but definitely should not be a salary if they're a 1099 vendor.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
Mhm.
We have one that's talking about the rental of the parsonage. So for a church that's renting the parsonage, where do they report the expenses that are related to that parsonage, such as the property management fees, property tax, maintenance costs? And does that impact their mission shares calculations?
So that is going to be an area where having that, oh, Bill is back. So that is an area where we are hopeful that having the breakout in both Pendel and Baltimore-Washington conferences statistics, there is a line just for rental and rental associated expenses, as well as sometimes we realize in a rental situation, it may not include everything. So if there are other expenses over and above the rental, such as utilities that you have to pay, you can put that on the maintenance and utilities line for the parsonage.
Okay, Dave and John, have you ever seen the situation where the pastor's salary is totally dedicated to housing? And how would you report that?
John, you've probably seen that more than I have.
Yes. So we've directed the churches to identify it as as it is written in the church conference. That is my understanding of it. But I'm not familiar with there being a hard and fast rule that is not something that can be presented. However, we have run into this situation several times where previous pastor was reporting all their composition as housing, and then the new appointment had base salary, and because of that change, it actually changed the calculation of the of mission share base. So depending on how that is, I guess I would be careful about how that is being worked out with the pastor. I'm not sure if that helps to answer the question, but that is.
John, the way I've always heard that talked through is that you report the pastor's compensation, the salary and the housing allowance as it's approved at the charge conference. The pastors all have the ability to work with their local church treasurer to adjust that housing allowance and cash mix after the charge conference, but it's a standard for the stats to be reported as it was approved at charge conference.
That's what I've heard as well.
Bill, are you up to speed on the additional questions?
Because my computer crashed and I got kicked out, all the previous Q&As have been cleared from my queue. So you keep going, Paul. I will smile and nod, and you keep asking.
I'll do my best here.
Some of these I can answer.
There's a little bit of the operations of AC Stats. Can you submit separate parts of the report if different people are working different areas?
So as John touched on, we find that it is best to have as few people actually doing the data entry as possible. However, this is this is up to you as far as if you know that someone in your church is only going to be doing table 2, for example, it is fine to have them working in table 2 as long as no one else is. But just know if 2 people are working in the same table, as John said, the system is automatically saving all the time. So if somebody puts a number in a box and tabs out, it's going to save it. If somebody else comes in 2 seconds later and puts a different number in, it's going to update it. So just make sure that if you are doing this, make sure everyone stays in their lane and does not overwrite each other's data.
And to dovetail on that, there's another question that was similar of having one person logged in. Sorry, 2 people logged into a single account. We'd recommend if you're going to have multiple people working on the system, that each person to have their own account. And to a specific point that was in that question, don't hit submit until the entire table is completed and accurate. Once you hit submit, we understand that to be done. So if one person is done with a table, just make sure that you guys are coordinating with each other as best as possible, that person's completed and that work is done. And then when all work is completed, then hit submit.
Very good. Do you have a good definition of what a capital expense is?
So I touched on a couple major repairs.
Do you have any dollar amounts that you might associate with that?
I believe that we set about a $1,500 threshold for that. Again, it's a major expense. It's an infrequent expense. Sometimes we will get asked, well, I have a janitorial service or that type of thing. If it's or a maintenance service, if it's a regular bill or contract service that you're paying, that is an operating expense. But as an example of that, if you have a contract with an HVAC vendor, for instance, that contracted amount, that monthly fee, is not a capital expense. However, if the boiler in your church goes up and it's a $10,000 repair for that, that amount is a capital expense because it's an infrequent major expense.
Someone did provide a clarification for the housing allowance question, that they're retired and part-time at two churches, and they're just paying the housing allowance as their salary. Does that change how they would respond on the statistical reports?
No, it should be reported as it is at church conference.
And what if it's a 2-point charge? Who reports which part of the compensation?
For that, whichever church is actually paying the compensation would be the one that's reporting that amount.
And for the statistical reports for 2023, is it all 4 parts, or what parts do they fill out?
So I saw in the question, when GCFA does allow conferences not only to add questions, but they will also allow a conference to create a separate table if they wish to do so. The old system, you would see table 1, 2, and 3, and if you created a special table, you could name that table. The person that asked that question probably picked up when John was in and demonstrating the system. The new system, any additional table just becomes table 4 or table 5 or table 6, depending on how many tables that you have. However, they will let you slide the table into the correct order. We have a table that was a utility worksheet and expense calculator that was meant to be between table 1 and table 2 when we created it. We can't rename it, so it's just now table 4, but we can slide it around, so it's now between table 1 and table 2. So that is where you might see that.
Bill, I have 2. So a little bit of the expense oriented, John and Dave. Salary and benefits. Is the cost of recurring contracted services included in this line, or is that line only for W-2 employees?
So if it's a contracted service, it should be an operating or a program expense. It should not be a salary. W-2 employee would be a church. It would be recorded on the church staff salary.
They pay the contracted services by a 1099.
Right. Yep. It'd be most likely an operating expense.
Pastor's asking about the housing allowance. Is the housing allowance, should internet, phone, and other costs included in the pastor's monthly allowance be included in the housing allowance, or are they church expenses?
That sounds like a question for our CEO and or CFO and treasurer.
I think you have to look at where it's funded. So there's a reimbursable line for most of those expenses, and that's the line where that should be placed on table 2.
Does it make a difference if it's being paid to the pastor as a reimbursement, or if it's being directly paid by the church?
I've seen some allowances that are like that. That's an oddity. If it truly is an allowance and it's carved out as part of your compensation package, then I'd prefer to have that in the housing allowance. You see it the same way?
Yeah. As mentioned, because there are so many variations in how churches will structure their compensation packages, and there's also variations in full-time versus part-time. As we've seen, part-time sometimes has a higher percentage of housing. Both conferences have really tried to fine-tune the church conference reporting forms to try to capture and clarify as much of that as possible. So those questions have probably been hammered out either just through the use of the form at church conference, or maybe questions with your district superintendent or church leaders during the church conference season. And so however that is reported on that church pastor compensation form should be mirrored on your statistical reports.
And where would you record the amounts that the church pays to Westpath for pastors UMPIP?
So that is on table 2. The line will vary depending on the conference, but it is a separate and distinct line from the pastor compensation and housing allowance area, and should be reported there.
We always come across new pastors, new people doing the stats in the local church that get new eyes looking at the way things have been recorded in past years. Can you give us any guidance as to if you come across one of those items, say they put capital expenses into their operating expenses, how do they go about addressing that?
So typically we'll see, we think the district is the best first point of contact, especially if that mistake has created a spike in mission share or apportionment. We try to get as much clarification and verification of stats up front, but we realize sometimes things will be misreported. So reach out to your district superintendent and let them know your concerns, and they can address your concerns.
We did have a good question. I've not come across this one before, but the lay leader salary, where does the lay leader salary go? So I want to know this church so I can apply for the lay leader salary, but I think that would go into the certainly the other church staff, right?
Yes.
Church staff and benefits. Bill, did you come across any others?
In the 2-point charge, if one church pays for all the expenses for the parsonage and salary, how is the mission share calculated for the other church?
Mission share is always calculated on the actual expenses paid by the church. So that would be obviously whatever church is paying more expenses for either the pastoral compensation or anything else, they will be the church that's paying more mission share as well. That would just be, I would say, an area where if you are sharing compensation expenses in a multi-point charge, that you just be aware of that as well, because that expense and other expenses in the mission share calculation for either conference are going to be impactful. So just keep that in mind.
We did receive a question about the deadline, excuse me, on whether or not we could use this as a chance to change the date to a middle of February date. I would just bring up to the attention of all those who are doing the stats that these stats are going before the CFA. Decisions are being made on those during the course of February. There are budget decisions that are being made by the end of February. The middle of February just doesn't work for this. We like the 31st with exceptions. Exceptions being you contact your DS, a district office, let them know your situation. We'll put a placeholder for the purposes of what we're doing for budgets. If it's past that first week in February, but for the general purpose of what we're doing here, let's keep it all at January 31st. Let us know the exceptions. We're completely wrapped up with this by the middle of February. And that's when we go to just allowing those who have contacted us with changes. That's when everything gets locked down, and that's when you contact your district office if any changes are needed after that.
Now, in the past, if a pastor's salary was below a certain amount, the housing benefits were not reported. Is that still the case?
Bill, I do not know that I can call Bill Westbrook, of course, but I've not been taught that. So I would certainly entertain that if anybody wants to talk that through with us to be able to understand the history of that.
And are you interested in any questions about the fund balance report? Those are already coming in now.
Well, fund balance is a good June 30th deadline.
Okay, so which column do you post the district grant money funding? In the cash received and recorded column or the transfer column?
John, John's our district administrator, former district administrator.
Table 3, right, John?
Are we talking about on fund balance or are we talking about table 3?
The question is about fund balance.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're not going to entertain that tonight.
Okay.
We'll confuse everyone that's on the call.
I would suggest they reach out to their administrative assistant or district administrator.
Sure.
With those particular questions.
We're always available to take sidebars on that.
Or call Paul.
Absolutely.
It'd be a TV show. Better call Paul. Those are all the questions that have come in, gentlemen. Oh, there's been several questions about the lay leader being paid.
Wow.
So when is the lay leader qualified to be paid a salary? Because I think there's a number of lay leaders who are now going to request a salary. One could be named Dolores Martin, but I'm not entirely sure.
Boy, both my wife and I were lay leader at our church a few years back. I feel like we've missed something. I did want to add, I was thinking of this when John was on table 1. We give guidance on table 1. There are some questions that can be confusing. Keep an eye out on the wording of each question. There are questions that will say how many people are in a group. Then there might be a question that says how many groups are doing X, Y, and Z, and then how many people are served by this activity. So keep that in mind when you're reading those questions. They can be confusing because they're right up against each other regarding the context of the question. So we always advise people to keep an eye out for that.
We do have a question about if a congregation voluntarily pays the custodial services, how is that recorded?
If they voluntarily?
So is it possible for a member of the congregation to pay a bill of the church and it not be recorded in your statistical data?
Oh, okay. So the statistical reports are meant to really reflect the actual expenses of running the church. We have had that question come up before, and the wording of the expense questions, you will see it will say how much was paid to or by in order to kind of capture that. We want to know what the actual expenses are for the church, whether or not they are paid by somebody else or paid by the church. So record the actual expenses.
And forgive me, I'm asking my colleagues on the panelists here. For churches that rent their parsonages out to not as parsonages, but as part of the as property, and they're receiving money for rental, where would they put expenses for those for that grouping? My understanding would be under building expenses, correct?
I don't think so. I know Paul and I have had this question come up. If it's that type of thing, it's really kind of it's really an income or investment type property, so that the expenses associated with that are really not associated with the operations of the church. So those expenses really do not need to be reported under the operating expenses.
I see that as well. Same with the preschool. I was fishing, John. I was looking for other questions here. So, Bill, how long would we like to go? Just for time management, do you want to go to 8:30 and we'll continue the questions continue to come in?
I think the questions that come in are getting to be very specific now and probably should be addressed to one of the three of you, that they're not general questions for everybody's answer. There was a clarification about the lay leader, and what they really meant to say that it was a lay pastor who was appointed to the church, not a lay leader salary.
Oh, very good.
And so that they would then record that under the pastor's compensation line item.
Absolutely.
I'm going to have to retract my email to my pastor saying I wanted to be the leader.
There is the remove send feature now that many email. So I think for the remaining questions, if you have line specific questions that are now coming in, line 55 or line 41B, I would suggest that they reach out to one of the three of you to ask for those specific as it pertains. We do have a general question that comes in just for clarification about the expenses paid by members of the church. They frequently have people in our church pay expenses directly, but I thought I heard Dave say we'd include those expenses. I replied that really it's what the church spends, because sometimes you may not know what a member is paying for a service. So how would we clarify that answer?
So if it's a service that the church would otherwise have to pay for themselves, then that expense, even if it's paid by somebody else, should be reported as an expense for the church.
I'm going to defer to Dave's answer.
That's the correct deferral. If a church is doing gifts from the budget to volunteers, musicians, those type minister, you think that's an operating expense of the church?
On that one by me again?
So they're buying gifts. Could be it's mainly volunteers. It's not staff gifts. So if it's a volunteer's gift,
okay.
where would you place that? I actually think I might find a programmatic line for that as well. Maybe a hospitality type of line item in your programmatic budget. I think a lot of this is determined by how you've structured your budget as to where that category might find itself.
I agree.
We know not to put it in the staff and benefits. We know to not put it in the compensation packages.
I would say, as a rule of thumb, and where to report things, and this may help clarify, especially in that example, if you would picture yourself reporting to your finance committee, if you're the bookkeeper for the church and you wanted an accurate accounting of how much you were paying for staff for the church, if you begin adding some of those, whatever you would normally report in that area, it's kind of a guideline, and that would be reported the same way as on the statistics.
And when would people expect to see preliminary mission share figures? Some are asking if AC Stats gives you an estimate, or does that come later from you all? That's
a little bit of a difference between the conferences, Bill. So the timing, we do a verification of the statistics in Baltimore-Washington currently. That verification gives you a first insight into a 2025 budget. That's not the same tradition that we have in Pendel. So
okay,
we'll keep those. We're not solving everything. We like the history of what we have within the two conferences, and we're letting that live out. That's good. It's not everything has to be exactly the same.
and offer one more question because two just came in on it about the rental of parsonage and expenses. One church uses the monies collected to repay a conference loan. So how's that recorded? Particularly if how is that reported? Particularly if there are repairs that are necessary.
I know in general for loans, we get questions. If you say you have a major repair in the church and you don't have the funds to tackle it, if you have to go to the bank and get a $10,000 loan to repair your roof, the $10,000, well, that might not be a great example. It's the repayment when you don't record the amount of the loan. So in that case, the $10,000 wouldn't be recorded as a capital expense because, as with most things statistics related, it's cash basis. So if you didn't actually come out of pocket to pay that expense, instead of paying with a loan, you don't record the amount of a loan. What you do record, if say the payments on that loan are $1,000 a month, that $1,000 a month or $1,200 for the year would be recorded as you make those payments as a capital expense, or whatever the purpose of that loan was when you're doing the repayments. That's the category that those repayments are recorded in.
Dave, if a pastor is receiving compensation from the conference to help support their compensation package, can you just explain how that flows through the system so that the church is not paying the total compensation as a part of their expenses for calculation of mission shares and apportionments?
So I know that the guidance and advice of GCFA is that they want to see the actual amount of the compensation. For Baltimore-Washington, we asked for that as well. And if there is a portion of that compensation that's paid for with a conference loan, in our calculations, that the income is reported in Table 3, and we actually back out the portion of the compensation paid with conference funds when we are calculating mission share.
You know, the labor laws certainly come into some of these questions. So we have a church that asks a question about a member paying a custodian and wondering if and it doesn't go through the church budget. Does the church then do a 1099? I would just ask that those types of labor related issues are really thought through well by your stewardship committees at the church. That is just a poor practice for you to hire somebody into your church and allow that to be a relationship where a member is making a payment and then not being reported through a 1099 purpose. So the correct way of doing that is you have a hiring contract with the individual. That individual who's doing your cleaning in the church has a relationship with your church that is best honored through a hiring agreement, and that gets paid through a church budget. So it's always, we always learn a lot through the Q&A when we do stats. And I just hope that this gives us an opportunity to touch on base on some other topics that are directly related to the operation of our stewardship committees at local churches. And just allow me to speak into that one. That hits pretty hard that a church would be doing it that way.
I would also say on a related point, and we see it really come up via the stats, always be aware of the tax code and regulations when it comes to who you're classifying as a 1099 payment. Some churches have, if somebody is performing services for you and you only, and you are directing the activities of that person, it may not be a 1099 person. It might be somebody that should be properly paid with a W-2. So regardless of how long it's been happening, I would always, if you have a question about it, seek the advice of a tax professional.
Well, gentlemen, on that note, we are coming up to the end of our broadcast. So I want to thank you very much for all the information. It is, again, always useful. We've had, at one point, we had over 400 people on the broadcast. And so to be able to handle that many questions for that many people, thank you so very much. Once again, tonight's broadcast has been recorded. It will be posted. Usually we post it to the affiliated conference website, which is pdcbwc.org. So you can look for that. There are times we also post it to the individual websites, but look for it on the affiliation websites, and we'll have the various PowerPoints available for you as well, the general one, and then those that are specifically related to the differences between each annual conference and what is reported. So gentlemen, again, thank you all very much. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, particularly as they dealt with wind and rain and power outages and getting kicked off of calls. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.